in organizing these mid-end exhibitions, it sort of has cultivated a different expectation of what I look for in art or what seems interesting or compelling to me, and it seems very different from, say, what I learned to appreciate about art or to look for in art like while I was in school, which was something that had more of like an angle, whether it was conceptual or in terms of like a novel use of material. And it kind of makes sense because the art world is opaque and it's hard to sort of find an entry into it for appreciation. And so, coming out of school, that was kind of what I was looking for, of something that I could like put into a sentence and make sense of. And then through working with John Massier and Rebecca Wing, and with the approach that we had with the Midden, which was a lot more, it felt more earnest in terms of just stuff that we were geeked out about and stuff that we liked, and that was what tended to make it into a show. I sort of started developing like a different sense of priorities around like what art I was invested in, interested in, and even that I myself would make that didn't necessarily need that easier angle or entry into the work. It could be something that was just sort of like gloriously that person's, and that kind of became what we looked more for. We use the word a lot, like idiosyncratic or other parallel words, to just sort of describe someone that seems to have gotten to a point that feels like, oh, that's really their own, and they're kind of thriving in that world that they made for themselves. So that's only ever like grown more so. The more I've looked at art, the more I've tried to like relate to it, figure out what I like about it. Is that aside from any sort of like clear stated purpose or conceptual agenda behind the piece, like is it just something that is kind of fearlessly that person's own, and that's something to celebrate for it. So when we jump back into it after 4 or 5 years of absence from doing these Midden shows, we've all like kind of gone a little further down that path in terms of what we like, but it also felt very familiar stepping back into it and just like scanning around the local art scene and what the three of us were aware of, and just picking out stuff that we were like honestly geeked about. And I do think that this version of the exhibition is that. We're excited about all the stuff in the show, and we were like delighted by a lot of the stuff that we found that we didn't anticipate. And it was just like the previous shows before it, like a nice affirming experience about what's going on in Buffalo and the art scene, and just like the sort of nature of creative weirdos in the landscape around us.
So the project that we'd done for Midden 2022 was kind of a revisal of the longer project that we did about 5 years ago, ending 5 years ago. And the way that it was different this time was that because of COVID, we didn't want to be necessarily in studio spaces with artists the way that we normally enjoy doing. So our thought process had to be a little bit more based around the things that we had seen and enjoyed just from the things that were being posted on Instagram or on artists' personal pages, or things that we'd seen in shows. So we already came to the table with some knowledge of what we were interested in showing, and then contacted those artists to really look at the work in person. I think that Kyle and I were talking about how this is something that wasn't that trying or taxing, because as everyday life occurs, we're always looking at art and enjoying looking at the things that artists make anyway. So it didn't really feel like that much of a stretch to take the things that we were already doing and use those as a catalyst for selecting works that we wanted to see in a show together. Some of the things were works that we'd seen that lingered for several years. I'm looking at the Tony Nash grid of paintings on the wall here, which I think we saw in a studio visit with him 4 years ago, a long time ago. And I had been thinking about these paintings since that time, because they really stuck with me. And then, some of the things were brand new. So Julia Dzwonkoski's Ghosts, she said she started making those in 2020, so they were pretty recent, and I had only just seen them, the month before we started putting the show together. So it was a fun mix. It was fun to see some of these things that had lingered and be introduced to new things. And that's it.
So it was a 5-year hiatus since we last did an Amid in Western New York show, a group exhibition derived from our studio visits with myself, Rebecca Wing, and Kyle Butler. And those studio visits were based on a working list that we would cobble together through discussion of artwork, of artists and artwork that we had seen, that we knew about, that we encountered on Instagram, that we wanted to see more of. And we would schedule studio visits and then make pretty fast decisions about what we were enthused about, what we wanted to see in the gallery, what works we wanted to see together. I think we've often talked about having a kind of gauge of iconoclasm to our selections. We like a little bit of weirdness, a little bit of the expression of personal visual language that comes through very strongly in all of these works. And weirdness is always a plus. So we made our studio visits, we made our decisions very quickly, very close to the time of the exhibition. In other words, not overthinking it, and in no way funneling it toward an overarching theme or any kind of curatorial precept beyond what we were enthused about at this given moment, at this time and place, in and around Buffalo, New York, which is why it's called Amid in Western New York. It's a snapshot. It's meant to be somewhat spontaneous in its organization and celebratory in its installation and presentation.
So I've been trying to do these quickly, but it takes normally about a week or two to do a painting. Probably two weeks to a month, I'd say, per painting. And I've been doing 2 paintings per day if I have video of my trip to work and my trip home from work. And it's very strange to be participating in a show. It's unusual. I haven't been painting for a long time, but haven't really been invited to participate in shows. And so I feel quite out of place here. I feel like these are out of place too, but it's been really a nice experience. So, I started by taking video of my commute to work and back from work on the dash cam. Like I set up a camera in my car to take video from my commute to work, and I didn't have a plan for what I was going to do with it at the time. So I had like about a year's worth of video of my trips to and from work, and eventually decided to try to do a painting from each trip, about 2 per day for the year. And, so I looked through the video of each trip and take some screenshots. I've been taking now about 60 to 100 screenshots of the video, and then looking through those pictures and deciding on one to do a painting of. And that's sort of my process right now. Well, I've tried to do a variety of things, but I have found myself going back to similar scenes. I'm not sure why, though. Maybe the composition or some other element in the picture. I really don't know though. It's kind of, well, I want to complete one for each trip, one painting per trip. So I'm going through them in chronological order, which is kind of fun. This has been, it's been a few years that I've been doing it now. So every year, there's a day when I'm doing the painting that is of the same day from the video. And that's kind of fun. It's kind of like a little anniversary for me that I enjoy. So at the end of April this year, I'll probably be working on a painting, God willing, that's of that day that I'm doing the painting. So the whole thing was kind of trying to get a project based on time and the calendar, and part of it was to try to originally part of it was to keep my website, have my website change daily, so I'd have a different content on the website every day, and the calendar is a good way to manage that. I could have a different group of content on the website each day, and once I get the whole year done, I'll be done, and I could just update in the individual day. They're oil paintings on like a canvas paper mostly, so, which is generally I have the most experience with most of the oil paintings.
So I just started painting over the pandemic, just as like a hobby. I really didn't think it was going to go anywhere. I mostly did it because I had a lot of free time and I needed to fill that free time with something. And then over, I think 3 months into painting, that was when I started to realize that I could actually do it. And it was a career goal of mine that I wanted to pursue. Then I started to paint more, started to try to learn more, tried to explore different media, different paints. And then, I just started to pick up, moved to bigger canvases, moved to bigger pieces, bigger ideas. And then with the subject matter, it's really all over the place. I don't really have, it's whatever I'm feeling that day. There are themes that you can see that are consistent throughout my work. I paint a lot of flowers, a lot of spectral figures, ghosts. Those are very popular. And then, I like painting clowns and mimes as well, really colorful, poppy stuff. But it's really just an expression of emotions that I can't express through words. So that's a lot of my work, is just figuring out what those emotions are and putting those on canvas because I can't verbalize them.
This work is under the title First-Hand Apostate, and I kind of can't talk about it without talking about my life a little bit. Being raised in a very conservative religion and kind of dealing with feeling very othered within that system led me to develop a language that kind of to express that in a secret way. And this work is all carved on leather and painted and dyed with that language. It's almost like a series of hieroglyphs or pictoglyphs that explain that story and kind of moves in a picture book direction from left to right. Being young in the religion, doubting it, having the loss of a parent, and then kind of navigating those circumstances while still having kind of a secret, is that I didn't believe it all, or it didn't make sense to me. So coming out of the religion, you're excommunicated, you're shunned by your family, and then kind of resetting and calibrating my life with children to a whole new community and to a whole new set of circumstances. And it's called First-Hand Apostate because it's my account of kind of leaving the faith And apostate is the worst thing that you could be called by someone who's still a member. It means that you've turned away from the truth in their mind, in their approximation. And I guess I'm kind of saying with this work that there's an understanding of the consequences of that turning away, and there's good to be had despite all the negative connotations that everyone who's still in feels, and that there's a whole other life on the other side of that divide.
I have several pieces in the show that are all interrelated. Most of them are about the visualization of sound, taking the idea of sound and reverberation and trying to incorporate it into a visual form. So I have 3 pieces on this wall I wanted to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about the middle one, which is called Green Haze. And what I started to do a couple years ago was to make pieces that had a lot of tiny marks. And I was actually thinking of trying to replicate the idea of static, because I really like that idea of static being a sound and a visual, and also being a void, because a void is what you saw on TV when there was nothing on. It was just a void of static, and it was a placeholder, so to speak. So I thought that was really interesting, and I was trying to incorporate it into drawings, but it never really worked until I used it as a field, or a fill, as they call it when you're making digital arts. And that started to make sense. And it's very time consuming because it's all hand drawn, little marks, all ink. And most of the drawings that I have here have something to do with transparency, because I wanted everything to be visible at once in most things. So everything is transparent ink, transparent watercolor. And so that is one of the main factors in that all the things are visible at the same time. In the middle drawing, I have a pattern that I made that is a repeating pattern, but everything is formed by not outlines, but where the marks are, and that defines the kind of wavy lines. And what I decided to do, so it wouldn't be so boring as just a plain simple pattern that was completely predictable, is I took the pattern, and at some point I took the pattern again and shifted it a little bit, so there was something unexpected that happens at the bottom. And the bottom part, which is green, is a shift from the original layout. And it's kind of confusing when you're drawing it, because it can get lost. And obviously there's guidelines. But then what I do at the end is take all the guidelines away and make sure that it holds together still visually as a pattern, and doesn't just become a group of marks. But that's all it really is, the group of marks that hold together. I also wanted to talk about this piece, which is right behind me, and it's a similar idea, but it's a much simpler idea in some ways. It's a pattern that I decided to make out of this sort of star-like shape, and I liked it because it felt like it was rotating, it felt like it had innate motion to it, and I decided to do something with the idea of color complements and transparency. So at first I was just using it as is, and it's actually a pattern that interconnects in every direction. It's kind of easy to do, and then I thought, well, that's just too stationary. So I wanted it to feel like it was twisting, so it's sort of windmill-like anyway. So what I did was I laid down color that's transparent. It's all just watercolor, a little bit of ink. And the color is transparent, so there's 2 repeats, and then there's 3 repeats. And each time there's a repeat of the pattern or the star-like form, it shifts a little bit. And with complementary colors, which are opposing hues, if they're laid on top of each other, or they're mixed together in an oil painting, they would be physically mixed together. They cancel each other out, and they actually dull each other. So at some points we see a contrast between them, where they seem to flicker a little bit, and other places where they lay on top of each other, they actually will cancel each other out. So the complementary pair is red, orange, blue, green, but there looks like there's a lot of black in there, but there's no black. It's all just red, orange, blue, green layered together. that makes the illusion of black. The last one, all the way over to the right, is called Dyad Shift, which is essentially the same idea. Dyads are another name for complements. Complementary hues are opposite hues, and the opposite on the color circle, but they also are a complete complement in that they contain all of the primaries. So for instance, if you have orange and you have blue, you have red, yellow, and the orange, and you have blue. So it makes a complete sort of primary structure in subtractive color. Different thing in additive. So what I did in that one was the same idea, but building it in little tiny lines, and they're all inked lines. There's a tiny bit of watercolor in it, and the lines are interspersed or interconnected this way, so that one form is orange and the other form is blue, and where they overlay, they don't completely layer over each other, they kind of intersperse like this, so that when you come close, there's a little vibration. When you come farther away, they cancel each other out, similar to the one that's right behind me. So it's kind of like the Impressionists use little pieces of color to create a reverberation or to create a mix. So it's an optical mix. But why? Because I wanted to create something that was like movement, like sound, and the actual motif in that is picked out of an old sound scientific experiment at the time, late 19th century. So at the time, they thought this was very scientific, but they made configurations that were meant to be sound, and they're actually kind of interesting now. They look just like decorations because they were sort of manipulated to look very symmetrical and so on. And I really like them, so I used them in quite a few drawings. In this case, there's a little bit of a shift each time. The patterns are not used in a symmetrical way. They're just shifted a tiny little bit, and one is left with no shift. It's just blue at the bottom. On this wall, I wanted to talk about first the one on to my right, and it is the same idea as some of the other pieces in that it's made of a lot of marks, and everything can be seen simultaneously. But I was getting a little tired of doing this very, very rigid pattern making and lines that I was doing to structure the other pieces. So I thought, what else can I bring in to bring it a little bit more to life? So I started thinking of patterns from nature or just patterns we see in our everyday life and translating those into the field or into marks that I could use to create a motion. What I started doing was just drawing objects, and anything that I saw was textured. And what was kind of interesting was I do some stuff with Illustrator. I haven't used it very much lately, but I brought the drawings into Illustrator and was able to just take my own drawings and just digitize them and make them repeat and make patterns that were even more complex that way. Then I took it back to the studio, printed them out, went back analog, traced them, and put them down. And in this one called Currents, the patterns underneath are mostly ink and graphite and seem to have a directional force back and forth horizontally. So I kind of stuck with that. And what I do is I lose track of what the actual image was in the first place, and I'm transferring them down, and then I just put as much down, overlapping incrementally, and I don't really have a plan. So I don't have a plan with these ones, I didn't have a plan of what was going to go on top. I just intuitively put these down until I felt there was enough. Then I had to decide what the image was on top. And I had been working with these sort of column-based images. So instead of specifically drawing it, I did it as kind of a silhouette with just the blue around it. And to me, it looks sort of like something tumbling along or tumbling through, and it looks familiar because it's image-based, but not so familiar that people think it's a picture of something. So that was my goal in that one. And the one over here is very similar. It has a little more specific objects on top, same process, same, I believe, same source material. I have so much source material that I'm not really sure what all I use, and I want it to get lost in there. I don't want everybody to see or think, well, this came from this, or I know what this is. My whole philosophy is the source material is there to make something, and then the drawing just informs it. And as long as it has some kind of motion or some kind of mystery to it, and is not too specific, that's what I'm aiming for. So at the top, I have these things that are more object-like, and it's called intervals because it seems like it has sort of flowing motion through it, yet there's these punctuated as it goes along. And the last one I want to talk about is this piece, which seems to me really different from the rest because it's part of a completely different series of pieces. When I start these, it's the same idea. I'm starting it very intuitively. I'm using watercolor and I'm just dripping ink into the watercolor. I usually have a color idea, but not much else. I just start. And I would tell students when I taught that sometimes you need to start without an idea and then apply the idea on top, or apply the idea later, or it's just a way of keeping me a little bit freer to make choices as I go, which I didn't do when I do painting. I can't paint that way. So even though this is sort of a painting. So what I did, I put down all of the base, and then I let it dry, and then figure out what kind of images I put on top. And these are this is a little more related to some other work that has more anatomical forms and things that are a little more from nature in it. So I had this sort of vessel-like structure that I put together in a different way than it was originally, and put it in as one object. And then the other structure I laid out in a similar sort of configuration, but it's all, if you look at it closely, outlines of flowers that have been clustered together. And I think it's the first time I did this, but I've done it with a bunch of other drawings. And then redid wash on top. So it's called parallel systems because sort of they have a parallel configuration, but also about movement of sort of liquid through these images, our body and inside plants. So I thought it was a catch comparison.
Well, my paintings, the way that I look at what inspires me to do this work, is not so much that people are strange, but that people are preoccupied with strange things. So a person might do certain things that would seem strange to somebody else, maybe their preoccupation or things that they do, or moments where they seem to react to life in a way that most people wouldn't. So that is what I tried to do. I also try to capture moments. That's what I like. Historically, you have people like Muybridge, who was interested in stopping movement and capturing that moment. And that's kind of like what I got interested in doing. I also like to mess around with materials. So even though I really only paint in oil, I only paint in oil. That's what I'm comfortable with. I still am not a purist, so I mess with it. From putting paper, I like doing that, but putting paper on things for background and then painting over that. Sometimes I put glue materials on and then scrape them off, and that leaves a texture. So I do that also. And then I also, probably my big thing is that I save old paintings that I've done that I didn't like. And then I revisit them as time goes. And usually what happens is I like the colors and patterns that were in different places in the painting. So I'll take that painting and I'll use it as part of a new painting. And it seems to work great for me. It fulfills a lot of what I'm looking for in a painting. So nothing is sacred with what I do. So it could also be that I have a painting that I already did something on top of something, and then I don't like it later on, and I work on that one too. So, so my paintings, usually the canvases are pretty old and pretty messed with. I also have no qualms about using materials that eventually will destroy the canvas. You know, kind of like when in the 50s, people like Becky Koenig, who used to use house paints. And, you know, now they find that, you know, all kinds of nightmares for curators, you know, what's ended up happening to these paintings. So I feel I feel the same way. It's like you should use whatever it is that inspires you or stimulates you, and that's how I look at it. So sometimes I put acrylic on top of oil, and so which you should never do. Sometimes I glaze things with acrylics on top of oils. Sometimes I use clear plastic, all kinds of things, resin on my paintings. So whatever gets the point across and makes me feel good about the painting. Once again, I paint for me, but enjoy showing it to people. And I also enjoy not giving too much explanation, because I don't think they do. I mean, I think people really don't come with preconceived ideas about art when they come to a gallery, and all they want to do is be exposed, have the experience, you know. So the least you manipulate what they see, the better it is for them. Let them make a story behind it.
So I'm a visual storyteller, and I tend to write stories about usually nonfiction, history, and science, and I work with both the written word and images together to tell the stories. So this is a piece about Lake Erie that I actually wrote about 5 years ago for City Lab when it was at the Atlantic, and it was originally envisioned as an online piece. And so it was at a time when I was writing monthly for them, and they would come to me with a single word prompt that I would respond to. So in this case, the prompt was wasteland. And I had been reading a lot at the time about zebra mussels in Lake Erie, and I had heard all these stories about sea monsters, like these legends of sea monsters, and I was thinking about climate change and about like the degradation of the environment, and wondering if I could weave those two together into a piece. So when I work, I often go back and forth between the writing and the visuals to kind of see how the piece is going to take shape. And this is actually a departure from the work I usually do, which is often done with collage and digital collage. So I tend to work with public domain photographs. I'm currently working on a book about US history that's all from photography from our national archives. And so when I started this piece, I was kind of doing all the research and studying the science and the history and trying to understand what had happened to the lake and how it all pieced together. And usually while I'm doing the written research and trying to understand what the arc of the story is going to be, I'm also digging into photo archives and other places to see what the imagery might be to complement it. And so here I realized that there really wasn't that much imagery that I could use, because it was about a lake, and so it's kind of the same, and also because it was more recent, like it takes place from the 1970s until today, so a lot of the imagery that was available wasn't free for me to kind of integrate into the work. So I decided instead to draw it, which I hadn't done in a long time, and I kind of started out as an artist doing more kind of drawing stuff, but then I moved away from that. So I wanted it to have this kind of wet and mysterious feel, so I ended up going with these different watercolor washes and then digitally layering them on in collage as I kind of put together the story. And so that's how I came up with this approach and what it was. But so when I originally made it for online, when you're reading online, you're scrolling down, and that's kind of how you're moving through the piece. And so when I had the opportunity to translate it for this space, I was kind of thinking about that and thinking about, you know, when you're in that environment or when you're working in a book, which are like the environments I'm usually in, you can really control how the reader is moving through the piece. And so that's something that I'm very comfortable with, is like controlling those pauses and that pacing. And so I think the biggest challenge for me trying to translate it into a physical environment was thinking about how the reader or the viewer would approach it in that way. And so that was like a really interesting experience for me, was to think about it at this scale, to think about what would be readable, to think about how a viewer might come up and like start, and would they start in the middle. And so I don't know if that ended up being completely successful, but it was a really interesting kind of exploration for me to understand that. And so I think that we ended up keeping something very similar, so you have these still kind of scrolling ways of reading through, but then split, so it takes up more of the space. And then I also just kind of did this hand-drawn piece at the bottom to ground it in the wall and kind of give you something else that just felt the hand. Like, I'm very into feeling the hand in the stories that I do, like both of my handwriting and the different pieces.
So I feel like I'm in my head a lot, so a lot of my work is inspired by kind of like an inner world that I have in my head that I want to get out. It's very colorful, and this world is very inspired by the clash of like traditional media and digital media. So I like to use a lot of bright colors in my work and flashy imagery and pictures of pretty girls, because it kind of reminds me of my childhood and like exaggerated girlhood and like those colors and those elements. But there's also a lot of other weird things that get into my head that I can't fully explain. So like that's where like the Mori painting comes from, like the bright colors, the pop of colors, but like not really making sense. And then also the digital media inspired by like the Instagram filter with the horns and all that stuff. I feel like a lot of my work is myself inside of it. It's like replications of my own feelings and emotions, and just stylizing them in a way that would fit into that world that I have in my mind. That's very, I don't know, it's I love like the anime genre, and like I love pop music and like hyper pop, and that super happy, like fun, imaginative style clash with like, you know, realistic thoughts and living in the real world and dealing with real issues, with my own identity even, just comes out in like a very weird like way that I can't really describe, but I feel like it shows a lot in like the type of work that I make is very like fun and juicy, but has like something like right under it that makes you like question, like I'm just always questioning stuff and always like wondering what things mean and how that meaning can be changed depending on how it's presented to people. So I just really like to experiment, and I have a lot of appreciation for different types of media and different types of art, and even with some of the stuff I make by hand, I just can't help but like, I want to touch and feel everything and make all different types of stuff and experiment and see how what that can mean and what that can say in my art. So I don't really know how to explain like what it all means or how it makes sense, but that's kind of like my inspiration for a lot of the stuff that I create. So yeah.
I'm a multidisciplinary artist working mainly in silkscreen and sculpture, and this installation was inspired by the kind of poorly built signs advertising vacant commercial lots in Rochester. What was interesting to me was often how they had this lack of consideration for aesthetics and often functionality, and so I kind of started to view them as these unintentional sculptures that were left by their makers around the city. A lot of them, have been kind of hastily rebuilt after they've been blown over in the wind, and they're advertising these building companies that are able to build to suit, and the signs that are actually advertising that future work is, they're poorly constructed, which was kind of humorous to me that they're sort of these cobbled together signs. They're built using, small pieces of wood that I kind of roughly made to scale to sort of reference 2x4s, and then I used silkscreen, a mixture of silkscreen as well as gouache to make the signs. And something that I was really hoping with this installation is kind of rewarding the viewer for close looking. There's a lot of really tiny details that you might miss from looking at the pieces farther away. If you start to look closely, you'll realize that some of the wood grain on the signs are hand painted, others are silkscreened, others are digitally printed, and I sort of was interested in that play between mediums and sort of this playful trickery for the viewer, and also bringing this scale change, from these large billboards and signs down to this small scale to sort of put the viewer in a different position where they're viewing these from above rather than the other way around. And most of the signs that I made were from observation. A lot of my process was just walking around the city and taking photos, or when I was driving, noticing a sign, and once I started to notice them, I saw them everywhere. And I also had some friends compiling images for me as well, where they would see a sign, and then I started to use those as reference material in the studio.
So yeah, I'm excited to be showing this piece here at Hall Walls, and it's a pretty new piece that I completed in 2020. As you can see, it's a oversized list of passwords, and it's very much indicative of my current direction in my work, which is oversized objects, usually things that are on paper, but that are being replaced by screen-based alternatives. So very few people even make lists on paper anymore. So that's one of the reasons that I turned to this large legal pad. And of course, the content also has to do with technology in this case. Thinking about the proliferation of passwords that we are all inundated with, and how they seem to, it just keeps growing and they keep changing, and there's a sense of overflow with the amount of passwords that we have. So I knew that I wanted the list to be overflowing, which is why it's a kind of almost exaggerated version of the type of lists that some people may have. You'd be surprised at how many people have actually told me that either they or their partner or someone in their life has something that looks just like this, because of course when you see it, it's not super functional, since a lot of the passwords are written on top of each other. I'm really interested in that kind of obsessiveness of passwords in particular, but language in general as related to the internet, right? There's so much of it. We are constantly inundated with communication, information, and it's often out of context and fragmented, and so I wanted to incorporate that sense of overflow and overwhelmedness here with this list. And passwords were such a good example, because we all are completely overwhelmed by the amount of passwords. I also wanted to play with what happens to the English language with passwords, which of course is this sort of funny combination where we're choosing something that is personal for us, that we're going to remember, and then we have to insert symbols and uppercase letters and lowercase letters, and I personally tend to just keep adding exclamation points onto a password whenever I'm asked to change it or not use the same password for everything. So we end up with these kind of weird phrases that feel very distinct to the password form, but that I was interested in kind of poetically as well. So you'll see there's a lot of exaggerated things with, exclamation points and insertions of numbers and symbols and things like that. So I thought this was a good second work to talk about because it is also part of the series that My Passwords is a part of, in that it is a large version of a smaller thing, and it is a thing that we are also not generally using the paper version of anymore, and we are much more likely to use the screen-based digital version, in this case a map, right? So this is a very large map, and you can see the folds that show where, if it was folded together and then opened up, those folds kind of stick in there, as folks who remember paper maps will know. I had memories of my early trips to Europe, trip to Europe as a college student, when a friend and I would just open up these giant maps of like Barcelona and try to find where we were and try to map a way back to our hostel and things like that. And I'm so aware that we just don't do that anymore. You always know exactly where you are, and the Google map or whatever your app alternative is will just tell you exactly where to go next. So you are just told, make a right, make a left, here you are, right? And it's this very fragmented sense of space, right? Instead of understanding the bigger picture, which you do with a large map and having to kind of locate yourself within the whole city, you just know what to do directly in front of you. And for me, that is a strange kind of distortion of how we understand space, and it's not great for my already poor sense of direction. In this case, with the map, it is super dense with information, as you can see, and it involves a lot of collage. That was the first layer. And so if you look closely, you can see a lot of different kinds of images of place, and I was interested in bringing together these kinds of images of a wide range of places, all different kinds of perspectives, and places that are all over the world. So to pull some examples, we have some of my own photographs of a building facade in Berlin. That one is over here. The Las Vegas skyline, that one is over here. Images from travel books, this kind of boat over here. A drawing of an architectural plan. What else? Images from India that I took. A Ferris wheel somewhere in Germany. Joshua Tree National Park, I think. So a lot of places that I've been, but also a lot of places I haven't been that are found images that I collect in my giant archive of collage material. So they're all sort of combined, and I was interested in this idea of a map that is not of any one place, but a kind of conflation of all the places with all of those kinds of scale shifts. So like when we think about a map, the reason that it contains information and is useful is because it has it's representing one place at one particular scale, so that we can use it. So I was interested in playing with what would happen when we sort of collapse all of that together and use almost every convention of mapping, every possible kind of place and image from all different angles. I also really love this idea of maps as both representational and abstract at the same time, right? Because of course they have a particular purpose in that they represent a real space, and they are an example of data visualization in the most specific way. So in that sense, they're not abstract at all. But when we look at the images, they are totally abstract. Random shapes are intersecting, random lines are crossing through. And it's that legend, which I've included up here, that gives us that code to sort of understand it. So it kind of got me thinking, what if all abstract paintings also had a legend or a kind of a key to what the different shapes and colors might mean? So I kind of played with that over here, where I would say that, this is cemeteries, and this is deserts. I'm looking for it. There it is, right? So, using these existing conventions, but playing with how you can drain them of meaning at the same time and collapse them into a sort of abstract frenzy. Yeah, so excited to move from the map over to these small paintings because visually they have a lot of overlap in the sense that they are super packed and dense with information, although each of these is contained to this small 1 foot by 1 foot support and literally encased in a frame of my own construction. So this is an ongoing series of these small paintings that are all exactly this size, and I've been working on them on and off for years, and they're often something that I turn to when I'm almost in between a larger text project or another kind of big project, and I kind of pick up on a few of these at the same time or at various intervals. There's always a bunch in progress, and I started making them because I felt that the uniform scale would help me bring some sense of order to the chaos. Prior to these, I was making a similar kind of work, but often on found pieces of wood at various sizes, and being more instinctive with how material came into my life and how I might just start working with that. And I decided that I wanted to be a little bit more intentional and give myself this limit of size and shape. And that was productive for me because there's certain things that happen that you kind of get to understand better as you work through a series in that way, and you set those kinds of rules for yourself. I mean, my practice always involves rules that I create somewhat arbitrarily and usually end up breaking, but as I was saying to a friend the other day, you have to start with those rules, at least I do, in order to have a place to go. So these usually begin with, again, with collage material. That's usually the first step, although not always. And then there's layers of paint that build up on top of it, as was the case in the map as well. And what that usually entails is I'm taking some of the formal elements of the found image, usually a photograph, and I'm sort of extending and distorting those. So I'm seeing what happens when I take this real thing, a recognizable image, and I sort of elaborate it into a more abstract place. And you know that happens in different ways. This one's not the best example because this one's went the other way around. I started with the pattern and added these collage figures later. But a piece like that one involves cereal, so kind of a cereal ad with large flakes and berries, imagery of bricks, and the title is Bricks and Cereal. There's a few other things mixed in. And I was just interested in sort of the flowy shape of the milk hitting the flakes and how those could sort of be taken out of context and the kind of texture and formal qualities of those elements. And then of course, as always, in thinking about how images from all different contexts can come together, right? So how is an image that's in an advertisement different than an image from the newspaper, right? Or a piece of photojournalism? And what happens when we bring them together, and how does that highlight different kinds of conventions? So there's a range of connection or faithfulness to the sources in these. You can definitely pick them out when you look closely, but in some cases they're hard to, they're buried. Particularly the last one at the end, which I was excited that the Hall Walls crew chose because it's one of the most dense things I've ever made, and one that I almost couldn't quite get my head around myself, so I was excited that they responded to it. But that one started with images of cake mixes and that have patterns on them. So this is kind of crazy. You can buy a cake mix that when you bake it, it will look like camouflage or a rainbow or tie-dye. And there are these kind of beautiful boxes that I saw in a display in Walmart. And come to think of it, I don't think I've ever seen them again. So maybe that's a rare product. But I took a photo of it, loved the idea of patterns on top of cake, with the kind of product packaging and all of that was just too good. So that became the base of the painting, as well as these kind of painted columns from a book on ancient Egypt, I think, and both kind of relating to decoration and adornment and this sort of obsessive urge to decorate, which I then carried to its extreme. So it's just packed with little tiny images that that just encroach on all sides, and you can sort of make out the cake mixes, but they're pretty deep. So that was a fun experiment. So last but not least, this is a piece called Big Box Store, and it shares some qualities with the pieces that we've been talking about: density, color, collage. It does introduce a new element here, which is the found objects, and I'll get to those, but I guess to start where I started, I was thinking about perspective, and that connects to some of the architectural imagery that you see in some other pieces, but I was interested in how single point perspective starts out as of course, a way to convey the illusion of three-dimensional space in 2 dimensions, but that it always results in these drawings with sort of these sharp diagonals and these kind of interesting abstract shapes. So I decided to pick a bunch of source images that had single point perspective, kind of dramatic views, and several of those came from the interiors of Walmart stores. So that's another connection to the cake mixes. Those might have come from the same trip. As a side note, I grew up in New York City, and I had not been to a Walmart until my mid to late 20s for the first time, and I just was sort of in shock by it, and how gigantic it was, how many products they had, because I was just used to smaller corner stores and things like that. So I took these photos of how deep the space was, these sort of infinite aisles with everything you could possibly imagine. Of course, now that we have Amazon, it's not quite as shocking to imagine one retailer with such a large breadth. But at that time, for me, I just wasn't used to interior spaces that were that big. So that's part of where the title Big Box Store comes from. It's also kind of a big box. But so there's Walmart interiors, a gas station, a guy standing in the middle of a collection of servers, and a couple of other things. And so I basically sort of lined those up roughly in the middle and decided that I would do a similar operation to what I do in some of the small paintings, which is that I take the imagery and I just extend it, right? So I take all the kind of perspectival shapes, these kind of infinite triangles in a way, and just kind of push them out in each case. So all of them do that, and then they extend and overlap in all of these different ways. So I didn't know how that would play out when I started, which is kind of what I was talking about before about setting a rule, but not really knowing what the result will be. That's a lot of the fun for me. So there were so many decisions to make in the process about where things would overlap, or what elements to maintain, what elements to distort. So I also knew from the beginning that I wanted to make a freestanding painting that was also kind of a wall, that's also kind of a piece of furniture or references a mantelpiece in some way. And I wanted it to start out with this crazy dense image on one side that would function as its own painting in a way, but then what happens when that painting extends over all sides of the object, right? And you can see also with the small framed pieces that the imagery often extends onto the frame. In this case, it goes even farther, so it goes all the way onto the back and onto the edges as well. And when it gets to the back, of course, you have no idea that it started with perspective, right? Because by this point, all of these shapes and lines have morphed beyond their original source, and they transform into other kinds of geometric or biomorphic shapes. And so the back has a very different vibe. But if you follow them, you can see sort of how each one meets a different kind of resolution. So I also decided that I wanted to make it even harder for myself to carry this imagery across all surfaces by adding these objects that create another barrier for painting and moving imagery from place to place. So you can see like the pink line here then has to cross onto this dictionary, and then onto all of these VHS tapes, and then over this phone. So the idea of sort of the single mark that has a long and slightly arduous journey was something that I was interested in.
This is a series about steel mills that I've visited in the last year or so. Industrial history has been something that I've focused on in terms of post-industrial environments. I grew up kind of in the shadow of Buffalo's grain industry as a teenager. I would hang out in different railroad situations, walking down the tracks as a kid, throwing rocks at trains. I grew up not far from an abandoned grain elevator that was probably abandoned in the 70s or something. So it was a very interesting visual environment for me as a kid. Later on in time, that kind of took direction into focusing on photographing different aspects of Buffalo's steel history. As a Buffalo, obviously, had a big manufacturing facility in Lackawanna that was Bethlehem Steel. Also, we have Republic Steel, a whole bunch of other steel mills. But these are mostly focused. This painting is some equipment. It wasn't from Buffalo's Bethlehem Steel. It was actually from Maryland. But this was a machine called a stacker reclaimer that was used to basically move around bulk material that was used in the steelmaking process. So how I work normally is I take photographs either that I've taken myself or I buy a lot of like industrial antiques and stuff like that. So I've acquired a decent collection of images of things that are no longer here that I would enjoy painting. So basically I'll work off a photograph, kind of reduce it to planes and abstract shapes that vary slightly from the actual thing as to where I'm not just doing like a photorealistic painting or whatever. If you look, there's a lot of implied movement, there's a lot of definitely simple shapes that might not be naturally occurring at all. I think abstraction in stuff like this is definitely something that appeals to me. Obviously color is something that I feel that can be used to put emphasis on things. Like if you're looking at these scenes in real life, you might not notice the vibrancy of like the orange crane, but when you step back and look at it, I don't know. To me, like the reoccurring use of orange, yellow, like safety green and stuff like that you see in a lot of these environments, I think is cool. So I've included that green more in that one. But yeah, I'm inspired a lot by the precisionist movement. There's artist Crawford who actually went to high school in Buffalo. He started off doing kind of like not typical at all, but kind of like traditional paintings of like American industry, really rendered, like precise, clean, crisp paintings of like factories. Charles Sheeler did the same. He was a huge influence on me. Ralston Crawford I thought was really interesting because over time he started going down this path to where he would focus more on abstraction than the literal actuality of the subject. So I've taken definitely a lot of cues from him in terms of painting. Definitely probably my primary influence at this point. The Buffalo connection was also really cool. His father worked on like ships throughout the Great Lakes industry, so he grew up in like port cities and around a lot of different elements like that. So yeah, I've been focusing on that. This painting is from a trip I took this summer with a friend of mine to Johnstown, Pennsylvania. There's an old Bethlehem steel plant there. I'll probably be continuing to chip away at this subject matter for a little bit until I find something else that is appealing to me, but I can see myself doing this for a while, probably continuing more into the abstract nature of it than direct representation. I think in the future I'll probably end up doing more cropped versions of these. I don't know, like if you were to kind of crop this a little bit more like that to even further abstract it to where you wouldn't necessarily have like a postcard-esque view or something like that, where I think there's a lot of interesting movement in infrastructure and industrial, weldments and supports and stuff like that. It's something that I photograph pretty regularly and I think makes for interesting content. yeah, I guess this all kind of ties into work I've done in the past. I paint on metal a lot. I went to welding school. I did like a adult education like welding program that I'll eventually start to utilize more into making like sculpture that will kind of play into all this stuff as well. Previous paintings that I've done, I've worked on metal and then left them outside or installed them in different lesser seen, illegally installed them in like different environments and kind of let nature, you know, weather them. And I would focus a lot on like how paint would react to like oxidation and like rusting and stuff like that. I really only started painting on canvas in the past. I've always painted on canvas, but I was really like doing the metal thing for probably the last like 2-3 years. So this was kind of the first chunk of paintings that I've done on canvas in a while. But I'll eventually probably start doing more work on metal again and weathering them to kind of like, I don't know, achieve, like these are very clean paintings. I'm not necessarily like, my work environments are not super clean. A lot of the places I am are not clean, so it's kind of an interesting comparison between those two. So I would like to work on metal more and kind of capture like the things that are really appealing to me with these environments, but we'll see. It's hard because with a lot of that stuff, leaving paintings outdoors, you know, like I'll spend like, I don't know, 50, 60 hours on a painting and then have it be outside and some catastrophic situation could occur to where that's either stolen or doesn't weather the way that I want, and you know, a huge chunk, like a critical part of the painting will like rust off. Yeah, I guess that's kind of where I'm at and where I've been the last few years.
This project, I think, in a really basic way, has to do with the question of how to get something going just on a blank sheet of paper like this. How to get something fresh happening there, and just like how to have a fresh thought in general. And I think I just landed on this very simple symbol for something that's really enigmatic, which is, you know, the state of being kind of between death and life, being alive and dead at the same time, being a ghost. And it's sort of an endlessly suggestive symbol for me, and yet it's also very easy to draw into like place in different situations and varying and to vary, I guess. So for me, it is, it's just a form that I can think in and kind of dream in and imagine in, and I think other people can do that too, because it's pretty simple, it's pretty down to earth, and that I think is like how to get something going that's down to earth and also really out there in a way is kind of the zone that like sparkles for me. And anything else? Yeah, I make a lot of these. I kind of try not to reject any idea. I like big ideas. I like minuscule ideas just as much, and I often find that if I just, you know, accept something, just say like, wow, this is good enough, like something can come from this, it will. Or, I'm trying to think of what else to say. But yeah, I often sit down without really a clear idea, or only a very faint idea of what a picture is going to be or be about, what it will even look like. Sometimes it starts with a phrase, which could be something something said in a conversation I was having with somebody, something I read, a variation on a news headline, something I dreamt. So it's all things from just like daily life that popped out at me somehow, and that so there's the words, and then sometimes I just paint. I mean, it's like a really fun, it's just 3 lines. It's really a pleasure to paint this funny symbol that we have for the end of life. Yeah, so the only rule is that it has to have a ghost in it somewhere, and I just noticed this one, like, it doesn't have to even be, like, this one doesn't even have a ghost visually represented. It is, but it takes up so much more room. So I guess a lot of it is also just playing with all the possible permutations of like formal composition with this very limited pictorial vocabulary. That's like lines, mostly black and white, mostly some color occasionally, and just small. So I like, there's something so insignificant about each one, and yet I think there's like a vastness of the whole, that it's just this unfolding thing that I don't even know